Okay, today I'm in the Lake District with Marten Julian. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us, Marten.
Thank you for coming all this way.
That's my pleasure. Basically, could you just describe your involvement, your occupation in racing?
I'm not a tipster. I loathe the word. I'm an analyst of horse racing matters, an author, a publisher, a journalist, but I would say basically an analyst more than anything else.
Okay, so we're in the Lake District now, but you were born in Yorkshire and then moved down south for school. Can you tell us a bit about your childhood?
Yes, I was born in the early 50s in a mining community in Leeds, where my father was a clergyman, and it was his first living, and it was fairly tough. I was a vicar's son, and I was, as I am now, quite tall, so I was a target for the local gangs. And there was a guy called Tom Black who used to hang out waiting for me, and so I used to have to circumnavigate my way home through different routes and round corners and nooks and crannies and ginnels, as they call them up here. And I think that's where I developed my interest in racing, from having to think round corners. And so that's where I started, and I went to school at a place called Chapeltown, which was fairly notorious as well. And then I was moved to a private school, which was a massive culture shock in Hove in Sussex, thanks to the support of a great uncle. And I was the only boy in the school with a Yorkshire accent. There were 70 boys in the boarding school, and I was the only one, and they got me to say things, and rather like those Smurf adverts where they fall over backwards kicking their legs in the air, these posh lads used to do that whenever I said bath instead of bath and path instead of path, and they never heard an accent like it before. So so it was one extreme to the other.
But little do they know that you're the reason you were able to go there. Your uncle was one of the founders of the NHS. They should have been a bit more respectful, shouldn't they?
Well, Sir Ivor Julian commanded a great deal of respect, and the headmaster, a guy called Edward Snell, and he knew that I came from the poor side of town, and all the others came from affluent backgrounds, all the other boys, and he had a word with my uncle, who is a local celebrity in Hove, Sir Ivor Julian, and said, look, Martin's feeling a bit left out of things. What can we do about it? And Sir Ivor said, I'll sort it out. So he turned up one Sunday and timed his arrival. He came in his Rolls Royce and timed his arrival to coincide with as we all made our way back from the church, and made sure that the Rolls Royce arrived just as all the boys were looking, all the 70 boys were looking, and he called out, he's got his chauffeur to call out, I'm come to collect Marten Julian. And I had to walk out in front of him. From that moment, I was of equal status with the others. He was a wonderful man, very supportive, and then did the same for my brother, supported him as well, who also had a similar background, Leeds and then Hove in Sussex.
So I assume that some of the boys coming from more affluent backgrounds had a bit of racing background. Was that anything to do with your the spark in the interest of racing?
We went to Brighton Racecourse once with some of the boys, but no, my racing was fairly dormant until my later education at my secondary school, at my other school, St John's Leatherhead, when I was one of the boys' fathers decided to take us to Epsom to Coronation Cup Day. And we saw Park Top running, and it was in the middle, and that's when I fell in love with racing, because I was tall, totally lacking self-belief and confidence, and I saw Lester Piggott coming up on the outside in a small field, looking over his left shoulder, looking over his right shoulder with utter disdain, letting out an inch of rain and just winning effortlessly on this wonderful mare. And I was totally bewitched and entranced and enamoured of it. I thought, I've never seen anyone with such confidence. I just wish I could have one modicum, a tiny, tiny proportion of the same degree of self-belief as he did. and I became a massive fan of Lester Piggott, massive fan, and backed him in doubles and trebles wherever he went, and that's while I was at school, so it was pretty illegal because I was underage and missing lessons to get to the betting shop at Leatherhead for William Hills.
So were you making it pay in those days?
The pocket money for the whole term was £2, and I won 32 and 6, which was enough to buy an album, and I bought Blonde on Blonde by Bob Dylan, so I doubled the capital allowance that we all had, and yes, I did make it pay, and it was wonderful going into a betting shop and having a sixpence Yankee or whatever, and seeing Lester Piggott clicking on all these lovely David Robinson horses. Bruce Raymond, he was another jockey who was lucky for me. Yeah, wonderful days.
So moving forward, you went to university, and then I was quite surprised to see that your first actual, not tipping, but advisory was Greyhounds. So how did that come about?
Well, I couldn't get to a racecourse. I was at King's College in London. I couldn't get to a racecourse, and it was quite a long journey to get anywhere, and we had no money. There was no money. My friends and I had no money. So I decided to go to Hackney Dog Stadium on one occasion, and I just thought it was, some of the characters there were wonderful. I mean, there were obviously, it was quite sparsely attended, but it was wonderful just seeing these greyhounds. I love them as animals. I was very taken by them as physically, their physiques and their elegance and their beauty. And I just got to know that certain dogs weren't going to win and other dogs were expected to win. And I studied it, spoke to a few people, and thought, well, I can probably make this game pay. So I had a few bets, and then I thought, well, I can make it pay a little further by advising people what dogs to back. So yes, I started following dog racing, and I got to know my dogs, and I got to know a few things about the dog game. You know, when a bitch comes in and out of season and stuff like that. And the first dog I ever tipped was called Chalk's Monkey. And my wife was having her wisdom teeth out, and I was meant to be there to support her because she was under anaesthetic, and she woke up and I'd gone because I'd made it to Hackney Dogs to see Chalk's Monkey win by 6 lengths, which is a long way for a dog to win. And he won a 5-1, and I'd advertised it to my clients as a potential tip. I'd had £14 in the world, and I spent £7 on an advertisement in a publication called the Handicap Book, and I got £15 back. 3 people sent £16 back. 8 people sent me £2 each for the name of this dog, and it was Chalk's Monkey, and I got £32 back. And in those days, a good holiday job paid you £12 a week, to give you some idea of the attraction of that business suddenly.
You're making it sound quite easy, but you must have put in some work before you got to that point. You know, you say you sort of studied about bitches in season, that sort of thing. I mean, how much analysis did you do before you became confident enough to sort of start betting or tipping, or not tipping, giving analysis?
With the dogs, I didn't do that much because it was a question of knowing the dogs and getting out there and speaking to people, and the form was secondary. When I 2 years later turned to horse racing, I devoted hours and hours to it, but of course most of those hours were spent on the road because there were no specialist TV channels in those days. So I thought nothing of getting in the train to go to a race meeting to see one horse and then coming back, and so it was a lot of time devoted to travelling, and form books went everywhere with me, and the Sporting Chronicle and Sporting Life, I couldn't really afford them. They were quite dear. The Sporting Life was 6pence, I remember, and it was a struggle to find the money to pay for that.
Okay, were there, do you have any sort of early mentors, anybody that marked your card a bit about where to start with the racing form?
Well, when I wanted to get into racing while I was at university, I wrote to Len Thomas and Peter Scott of the Telegraph and Peter O'Sullivan, of course, and Clive Graham. And Clive Graham wrote back saying, "Thank you for your letter. There are 320 holders of the press badge and you're unlikely to be the 321st. So it wasn't very encouraging, but the one man who became a mentor was Brough Scott, who I love to bits. I mean, he gave me the support and he opened doors for me and encouraged me and got me to meet him at the races. The first time he asked me to meet him, he was covering York for ITV 7 days. And I got in a train and went all the way up to see him, and I'd spent as much money as I had. I had very little money in those days. And I went to York and I saw him briefly and he said, "I'm sorry, I'm too busy, I can't see you now." So I had to get in the train and go all the way back without having managed to spend as much time talking to him as I would have liked. And but then I got to meet him again, and things went on from there with the Sunday Times job and stuff, which came a couple of years later. But Brough was hugely supportive of me in every way.
Okay, but before we go to that, I want to talk a bit more about your advisory, SRAS, that you started. Now, you told me that 6 to 10 advices a year you used to give. Now that is very, very selective. What was your selection method for that? Do you want to tell us that secret?
Well, there were only 6 to 10 selections a year because firstly I was very conscious that I was giving advices to people and they were putting money on, and I used to lose sleep over it. It was nerve-wracking and stressful and difficult to handle emotionally for me. I mean, my father was a vicar, my mother's a nurse. I come from a vocational background. I don't come from a hard-hitting business background. So things were quite difficult for me. So I couldn't stand the stress of giving more than that. And the other thing is I had to wait till everything was right, and I had 5 or 6 factors that had to be together. I mean, I stayed. One trainer who was very lucky for me was Michael Jarvis. So I focused very much on Michael Jarvis's horses. Bruce Raymond, as the jockey, was lucky for me. But I was a keen follower of speed figures. There weren't speed figures in those days, but I looked at comparable times. I looked at the Sporting Life used to publish gallop reports in those days. So the Weekender still does them, but they're not as full as they used to be. But the Sporting Life used to publish gallop reports. So I looked at which horses had galloped with which horse. And if one of those horses had seen galloped with a horse of superior class, then I took it as a hint. That's how I found Just Revenge, the very first tip I gave, which won at Doncaster, beat an odds-on shot of Jeff Raggs with Pat Eddery riding Just Revenge. And I trained by Atty Corbett many years ago, and I saw the horse had worked with a superior horse, and it was a once race maiden, Just Revenge, with just a naught next to its name. So I tipped it, and it won a 15-2 at Doncaster in a maiden, and it was beautifully unexposed, and the clients loved it and assumed it was inside information. So I used. Everything I used was available. Virtually everything I used was available to anyone else. I didn't have any privileged access or information, and I don't recall speaking to any specific trainers until much later than that. I was too nervous to go up to them.